From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, The Zoomer, hosted by Libby Znaimer.
Welcome to The Zoomer. I'm Libby Znaimer. Canada has long been a beacon of hope and opportunity for people around the world. Our country is celebrated for its diversity, welcoming spirit, and the rich cultures that contribute to our multicultural identity. A recent Statistics Canada report stated that Canada's population growth rate in 2023 was the highest since 1957, and 97% of that growth was the result of immigration. However, Canadian support for immigration is dropping. A recent poll by the Association for Canadian Studies and the Metropolis Institute found that half of Canadians agree there are too many immigrants coming to Canada. These voices of concern on immigration point to the large numbers of immigrants affecting housing affordability and adding to the already strained medical system. But the more prominent concern is the issue of who Canada is letting into the country to become citizens. It's a question of vetting. Are we bringing in people who disagree with Canadian values? Warren.
Well, it is a subject of debate quite a bit these days. It's never racist, it's never inappropriate to debate immigration and refugee levels. But I think, particularly since October 7th, people are seeing things on their TV screens and their computer screens that they disapprove of. And they're wondering if it's being contributed to by people who are not from here or don't share our values. And this is why you're seeing premiers across the country giving voice to that. And it's something that merits discussion.
Chris, what do you think?
Our values are codified in our laws. If you come to Canada as a permanent resident, you become a citizen, you have to show respect for those laws. You have to live under those laws and change them through the political system if that's what motivates you. But we know from statistics that immigrants, especially recent immigrants, are more law-abiding, less likely to commit crimes than people who are born in Canada. We also know that there are as many people or more radicalized online who were born here as there are people who came here. So I don't think we should identify today's challenges, international or otherwise, with our immigrants. Our immigrants are generally law-abiding. Our immigrants meet a high standard to come to this country. We have much larger issues to deal with, and one of them is upholding the rule of law in Canada. It's a crime in this country to espouse the agenda of a terrorist group, to call for genocide against a group. The law has not been enforced in Canada, especially in the last couple of years, on a number of occasions, and that is rightfully a focus of public debate.
Well, a lot of laws have not been enforced, unfortunately. How much of this is an issue of bringing in more people than we have infrastructure for? We've heard a lot of talk about, well, their immigrants are putting up or making housing more unaffordable. We've had issues with international students, and they often get really taken advantage of. So how much of it is a resource issue versus a values issue?
Our immigrants are selected on the basis of their education, their experience, whether they have relatives in Canada or not, whether they speak English or they speak French. We don't assess them on their values. It's hard to do that. So we are bringing in people that may not share our values. And a lot of Canadians feel that that's exactly what we're doing. We're bringing in people, then they see some people on the street doing things that we're not accustomed to, and they said these are values that are coming to our country. They don't respect our Christmas parade or our Santa Claus parade. They're not respecting us in the malls. They're not respecting us on Remembrance Days, and that's a problem. I think the question of, oh, I can't find affordable housing, and I've got to take a train so far to work, is not really the big one. I think the values is really what has divided the country on the question of immigration.
Siavash, you came here to escape the Iranian regime, to escape prison. Yeah. What do you think do you see people who espouse what that regime stands for, and what's your view of it?
I believe you can absolutely vet for values when you're talking about immigration, and it is not true that basically the Canadian citizens born here get radicalized more than the immigrants. First-generation immigrants are the majority of radicalized groups in every country because
the first generation born
yes,
here.
Born here.
Yes.
Yes, so they are born here, but they are first-generation immigrants because the crisis of identity.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah, but they are immigrants from countries who hate Western values. And they go to universities, they go to schools, and they are taught in universities that everything you thought in your country about the West is actually true. West is evil. White people are dominating the world. They're killing everybody. If your country is in bad shape, it's because of the West. That's it. And what do you expect that person who grew up looking for an identity to look for?
You say you can test for values. How?
It's very simple. There are polls in many countries. For example, I come from Middle East. In Middle Eastern countries, they've done polls on several issues. LGBT issues. Over 80% of people in Muslim countries, at least over 80%, it goes up to over 98% in some countries, believe LGBT people should be treated as criminals or even worse. Other things should be done to them. That's something you can vet. It's not that difficult. From those countries, maybe don't take that many immigrants, only refugees who are actually refugees because they clashed with that culture.
Okay, we'll get back to that in a minute. Recently, Ontario Premier Doug Ford made these comments implying immigrants were behind a shooting at a Jewish school in Toronto.
We have zero tolerance for this anywhere in Ontario, and it doesn't matter what race, what grade, what religion you're from. I'd be saying the exact same thing if it was another community as well. But enough is enough. You're bringing your problems from everywhere else in the world. You're bringing it to Ontario, and you're going after other Canadians, as the Prime Minister said. Unacceptable. I got an idea. Before you plan on moving to Canada, don't come to Canada if you're going to start terrorizing neighborhoods like this.
Well, the Premier took a lot of flack. He implied that immigrants were behind that shooting when there's absolutely no evidence. And he was called on to apologize, and he didn't. And the interesting thing is that even though there's no evidence, a lot of people agree and support him on the back half of what he said, which is don't bring the old hatreds. What do you think of those comments and the critique of them?
Well, in fact, there is evidence. I mean, 48 hours after he made those comments, a school was shot up. School for little kids, little Jewish kids, and a school was shot up in Montreal, and a synagogue in Vancouver was firebombed.
And another one yesterday.
And just 48 hours ago in this city. So, you know, somebody in political life, but prosecutors and police too, are entitled to exercise judgment. We give them authority, we give them power to exercise judgment. And it's reasonable to say that, you know, as you pointed out, if your values are not consistent or congruent with Canada's, well, we're entitled to draw a negative inference about that. We're entitled to make some decisions about that. And it's not something that you have to question somebody about at the door, because you're probably not going to get the most truthful answer at the door, but you evaluate somebody's conduct and the way they behave as a human being and as a citizen. And if someone stands up at a rally in Montreal, as someone did in November, an imam, and says, in front of 20,000 witnesses, Jews should be slaughtered by God, well, that person isn't acting in a way that's consistent with Canadian values. That person is still walking the streets in Montreal and wasn't charged. So the failure there is not so much his, it's ours as a society.
Libby, I think that you're right. Doug Ford has no idea who shot at the Chaya Mushka school in Thornhill or Jesuit. I should say, I think there's a lot of people thinking what he said, that they're looking on the screen, they're seeing violence, intimidation, harassment at the rallies since October the 7th, and they're connecting the dots. They're saying, you know what, I think that's also the case. Canadians are not accustomed to seeing girls' schools being shot at. So the logic must be, it must be coming from somewhere, must be coming from abroad.
And it is coming from somewhere. But I think we really need to be careful not to scapegoat immigrants or
100%.
refugees
100%.
without evidence. And even with evidence, we need to be very confident that it is representative, that it is accurate. People will cite, little micro samples. That's not enough. What we are facing today is a law enforcement challenge, in my view, and I think in the view of a lot of Canadians. We have laws against hate speech. We have laws against calling for the destruction of peoples. They have not been enforced, or they have, in some jurisdictions, been enforced too late. And we are all in Canada, and especially in the English-speaking world, living with a tidal wave of disinformation and propaganda, especially after October 7th. Pro-Hamas propaganda, pro-terrorist propaganda. But there have been many other parts of the wave. And sometimes the immigrants are the ones that actually help us protect ourselves against disinformation and propaganda. I would rather have a Ukrainian brief a group of Canadians about what constitutes Russian propaganda than someone I went to school with in Toronto in the 1980s, because they're not aware of how the Russians are operating. The Ukrainians, the Estonians are aware, and there are groups that are much more aware than we are, like dissidents who have left Iran, of how Hamas terrorism works, and we should be listening to them as well.
Okay, we're going to pick that up after a break, but we need to take that short break, and we'll be back with more of the Zoomer. Welcome back. During the 2006 war in Lebanon, we learned that 50,000 Canadians were living there. Most had returned after getting their Canadian passports, which is why they're often referred to as Canadians of convenience. Our government evacuated nearly 15,000 of them at a cost of nearly $94 million, and roughly half of those evacuated returned to Lebanon after the war ended. Now, this caused the government in 2009 to change the rules for limiting passing on Canadian citizenship to the first generation born outside Canada. Well, now the Liberal government has announced a shift to restore the rights of so-called lost Canadians. It allows Canadians abroad to pass down citizenship to their grandchildren, and they can do that after living in Canada for only 3 years. So is this righting a wrong, Warren?
I'm not sure it's a good idea. The thing to keep in mind about this government, the Trudeau government, and I advise Jean Chrétien, we never had a situation like they've got, where they're 21 points behind the Tories. So when you're 21 points behind, you're just throwing everything that you've got at the wall to see what sticks. And this, it felt to me, this was something like that. I mean, there was one point in the press conference where the minister was asked, just, what you just described, how many people are going to benefit from that? How many people are going to come to Canada as a consequence of your change? And he said, I don't know. And that's a hell of a way to make public policy, but it's symptomatic of a government that's in big trouble, and they're just trying anything that they can. I'm just not sure it'll be terribly popular.
Chris, it was your government that tightened things up after that experience in Lebanon, and people were outraged by that.
They were, and Lebanon was the trigger. But there were other cases where there were large numbers of groups of Canadian citizens living outside of the country, passing on citizenship with dwindling connections to the country, not coming back here, generation after generation. And it wasn't just Lebanon, it was Hong Kong. The Emirates have a big expat population, not as big at that time, but it has grown. And the objective of the policy, which had happened by the time was in place by the time I became minister, was to ensure that there aren't sort of separate Canadas out there on other continents or even in the United States with huge numbers of citizens with no real substantive connection to Canada that were just reproducing themselves. And so this was the strategy to prevent that from happening. Will this restart that phenomenon? Maybe. I don't think it's going to be very popular, though. I think Canadians want Canadian citizens and permanent residents to have a living connection to the country.
Well, yeah, and presumably they do it to make some money here, to get a Canadian passport, and to also, if they go back to a place with war, to get evacuated. Guidy, I would bet that you have facilitated immigration for some people who are Canadians of convenience.
For sure. I mean, we've represented all kinds of people over the last 37 years. I think we all at this table probably agree that Canadian citizenship is actually very valuable. You walk around with a Canadian passport, you're a somebody on the international scene. You can cross into borders, you can cross into countries very easily. It means something, and we have to be very careful not to cheapen that asset. That passport should not be cheapened. And I think Canadians want to know that if you're going to have this passport, either you're born here, you live here, you work here, you pay taxes here, you support our way of life. That's what they want to see. They don't want to see that 3 generations down, some child gets a Canadian passport when he's never lived in Canada, his mother's never lived in Canada, grandmother's never lived in Canada. They don't want to see that. And Lebanon taught us that. Lebanon was very, very clear. People were living in Lebanon. They were very happy. They got in trouble. Suddenly they're Canadian. As soon as they were safe, they went back. And people didn't like seeing that.
As an immigrant, what do you think when you see this?
It's a joke. It's so ridiculous. It's not even, the wording of it is first generation and beyond. That boggles me. Like, what does beyond mean in legal terms? Like, does it stop with grandchildren, great-grandchildren? Like, how far can we go?
Well, that's why Warren said they don't know how many people it's going to affect, because it's impossible to assess population growth, how many kids people are going to have over the next 3, 4, 5 generations. And so how are you going to come up with a number? The answer that was given is true, but in the context of making Canadian citizenship and immigration policy, that's not the answer that we need to hear.
Citizenship of a country should be treated with respect. It's something to value and be grateful for. It's not like, okay, I went to visit there for 3 years and now I have this thing that I can always use for my grandchildren even whenever they want to go live there. It's not a summer home. It's like your country. You have to have some level of pride in it.
So I have some questions about how it's done in other countries. So I think that if you're a descendant, you can get certain EU memberships without having a big connection. But the other thing I noticed is that if you're a dual citizen of the United States, you've got to keep paying taxes, even if you don't earn money there. I'm wondering if that's a solution.
I mean, European countries generally have greater emphasis on who your relatives are. So if you had a grandparent who was French or whatever, you will have the ability to apply for EU citizenship and even UK. In North America, we've tended to emphasize where you were born. Anyone who was born in Canada, hence we had the case of the Russian diplomats who were born here, were they diplomats or not, they ended up with citizenship because they were physically born here. But there's room for debate. And we've always had both principles to some extent. We just don't want to create the kind of absurdities that we all recognized had happened in the past or recreate them. But there's a real debate. How many years should a permanent resident be here before being entitled to citizenship? It was 4 years. Now it's 3 years. It's a question. If you're a permanent resident, how many months do you need to spend inside the country to qualify? It's a debate. And generally, this government has weakened those ties. The Chrétien government and our government were a bit more robust in insisting that there be a stronger tie.
Okay, hold that thought. We have more of the Zoomer when we return. Welcome back. Along with immigrants being welcomed into Canada, there are pathways to citizenship for refugees, foreign students, temporary migrant workers, and individuals on temporary visas. The government recently cut back on the number of foreign students because the increasing number led to a shortage of rental homes and caused rent to increase. And so, another question, should Canada be opening its doors every time there is a world conflict? Canada recently increased the number of Gazans it will allow in, while none of the neighboring Arab countries will accept them. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to bring my brother here for a visit, and he was rejected. And then I heard the Gaza story, and it was really fascinating. Like, it warms your heart, you know, when you realize what type of people the government is willing to bring for political purposes, for a show, rather than actually helping Canadian citizens who've been here for years and been doing nothing wrong. They're not allowing even, I know a lot of people whose sisters, mothers, it's not easy to bring relatives for a visit here. But the government keeps bringing people from like Gaza. We know the population of Gaza. It's very heartbreaking, but there's a reason Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, they don't open their borders to them. Lebanon opened, made that mistake, and saw the result. Decades of civil war. That was the direct result. That's why everybody closed their borders. So I'd say, hey, maybe look at the neighborhood and see what the neighbors are doing when it comes to certain people.
Why was your brother rejected?
No reason. No reason was given. It was just, we're not sure if he's going to return. That was it.
Risk of an asylum claim, almost certainly. And this is the issue that most Canadians don't see, that anyone who's worked in our embassies or worked abroad sees very clearly. When the number of asylum claims from a country goes up, then it becomes harder for a citizen who doesn't intend to claim asylum, but who wants to come for a wedding or to do business or to see Niagara Falls, to get a visa. And so there's a complex interplay between our asylum system and the larger flows of visitors that we want to see coming to this country.
Chris is absolutely right. It's called the temporary intent problem. An officer has to be satisfied, for example, that Siavash's brother is going to come and he's going to leave. Well, if he's coming from a country or a family situation which is not very attractive, what the risk is that he's going to come here, visit his brother Siavash, and say, you know what? I don't want to go back. I think I'm going to stay here. And that's the ultimate job of the immigration officer overseas, to make sure that if you allow somebody in, they go back home.
Let me ask you this. Is there any distinction between countries where asylum seekers are true asylum seekers and countries where those claims are often denied?
Of course. There are countries that we don't have visa requirements on, and some of their nationals come here and they seek asylum. That's just a fact. There's no correlation between risk and the asylum process. If you get here, you can make an asylum claim. If you're an American citizen, a British citizen, it makes no difference. You can make a refugee claim in Canada. So you're not getting your best refugees, the ones who are in greatest need. Why? Because there's no chance they're ever going to get a visa. They're in a war-torn country. They have no money. Their home has been demolished. They have no ability to come here. Those are the real refugees which simply don't have access to our system. Somebody from, for example, Mexico. I'm not saying you can't be a Mexican refugee, but it's not what I think most Canadians are thinking about when they're thinking about supporting a refugee system. They're not thinking Mexico, they're thinking Afghanistan, they're thinking Syria, they're thinking something else.
You know, politics is about choices. It's about choosing and applying your judgment to a set of facts that move around all the time. So, for example, the present government has chosen, as you just pointed out, to admit hundreds, potentially thousands of Gazans. And so the judgment, I think, that we should be applying in that case is, well, in the educational system of Gaza, near where I was just a few days ago, children are taught that martyrdom is appropriate, that murder is a proper expression of a society, and that the Zionist entity, as they call Israel, needs to be destroyed, and ultimately us too, as those of us who are allies of Israel. So that's judgment. And we need to apply judgment to that. And I don't really care what the rules are that are promulgated by officials in Ottawa, because those change all the time. As a society, we're entitled to exercise good judgment for the benefit of this country and the people who live there. And at the present time, I don't think that's happening.
And I would easily digest that, my brother's rejection, if the Gaza thing wasn't happening at the same time. I'm like, okay, I understand you're not going to take refugees from certain countries. But then when you bring thousands from Gaza, then it's like, it's a weird situation.
I mean, in answer to your question, there are countries where it's easier for an asylum seeker to get because they're right next to places that people are fleeing, right? That's just objectively the case. We see the huge numbers in Turkey and so forth because of what's next door, and sometimes what's happening in Turkey itself and similar countries. But we also have to keep in mind, as we make judgments about our system, that the whole system for protecting people who are fleeing persecution globally has not collapsed, but taken many steps backwards. There are very few countries in the world that now have a fully adjudicated, fair refugee determination system, asylum system. Europe is very tough. The United States has flipped from one extreme to another, and so we can't solve all the problems ourselves. I think we do better when we have a well-managed asylum system where people who get visas are coming here for the things they say they're going to do. The number who claim asylum when they get here is relatively small, and we have more capacity to give Canada's protection to people who really need it, who really deserve it, who share our values, who are truly fleeing persecution and death.
One thing that can be done to separate this mess is refugees of war should be separate from other refugees. Refugees of war, the main thing that they need is a safe place. They want to go back to their homes, but at that moment they can't. So if you can create an environment close to where they are, that would fix a lot of this mess of mixing all sorts of refugees.
Okay. We'll be right back with more of the Zoomer. Welcome back. Canada's Family Reunification Program allows Canadian citizens to sponsor relatives to immigrate to Canada as permanent residents. However, recent changes introduced a lottery system that is seen as unfair, as families are waiting years to be reunited and new families cannot get into the program. So why promote a family values program if families are not being reunited? Guidy.
We're a nation of immigrants. So that means we've left our homes overseas, left our parents behind. So because of that situation, we feel that we should be able to bring our parents here to Canada so that we can be reunited. The problem is that from an immigration point of view, that's not the demographic you want. You want young people. You want another country to raise those kids while they're not paying taxes, educate those kids while they're not paying taxes, and then when they're ready to work and pay taxes, you want that demographic here to enrich the country. People who are coming when they're in their 60s or older, 70s, 80s, chances are you're not going to get too much tax revenue out of them, right? In fact, what you're going to do is probably going to have a very high health cost. And so that's why the government wanted to limit the number of older people coming through the parental sponsorship. And they didn't know how to do it, so they said, we can't let in all these people. All these people qualify. So we don't want all that. So they introduced a lottery system so that they can manage the number of parents and grandparents who come to Canada.
Now, my understanding is that there is an unofficial cap on the amount of health care the government thinks they'll need, and that cap was recently tripled. So my understanding is that they used to assess the older people and say, if we think they're going to need about $7,000, which is per capita, that's cool. But any more than that, we're not letting them in. And that was recently tripled.
I'm not sure about the numbers that have changed, but I think there has historically been a disconnect between federal decisions about parents and grandparents coming to Canada and provincial policy and potential capacity to manage the healthcare system. Provinces complained to me when I was minister that you're doing this without giving us resources, without telling us who's coming. And now with larger immigration numbers, they're probably doing that even more. And I think something else that's changed is that after the pandemic, when Canadians saw the limits of our healthcare system, it's heroism, but also the things it was unable to do, and the parts of it...
And continue to be unable to do.
The parts of it that are fraying around the edges, they started to think more about immigration as an aggravating factor in terms of an already threadbare healthcare system, just as they are also doing the numbers with regard to rental costs and housing costs. If there was enough housing, if there was strong healthcare with excess capacity, people would probably be comfortable with even higher numbers of immigration.
Should the government stop pretending that it's in favor of, family reunification? Is that a promise to immigrants? Come here, work hard, and you'll bring mom and dad over.
I think in their defense, successive governments of different stripes, everybody's trying to come up with a solution to deal with a problem that we didn't used to have as much. It's hard to get to Canada, unlike the countries in Europe. And we've seen these tragedies where people are crossing the Mediterranean in, leaky boats to get to Italy or other places. Now, increasingly, we're seeing people coming here because of climate change, because of war, because of famine and terrible abuses of human rights, all kinds of reasons. They're finding their way here as well. So we need to have a clear sense of a government decision that is going to work for not just Canadians, but for those people who are coming here. Because as my friend was saying, we are in fact a country of immigrants and refugees, and we've benefited from that. In the future, we need to have them to pay for the social programs that we benefit from so much. But man, people are just so unhappy, including the people who are coming from other countries. The people who I find, and this is not subject to a public opinion survey, but I can do one if you want one. If you ask people who have come here recently what they think about the immigration system, they say, shut the doors.
Oh, I know that all
That's
too
it.
well. They can be more hardcore than people born here. And especially if they think that they have followed all the rules and somebody coming in after haven't, that makes them really mad.
Absolutely, and that's what's happening right now, I think, is, since the 7th of October, and we're seeing all these extraordinary things we've not seen before in Canada. We really haven't, maybe since the October crisis in 1970 in Quebec, but nothing like this. And people are unhappy about it. Maybe not Gen Z and millennials, but people who are old folks like me are not happy with what they're seeing.
When we come back, we'll hear questions from our audience. That's next. Now it's time for questions from the audience, starting with Shuva. Hello, Shuva.
Hi, thank you for having me. I used to live in Australia. Then I came into this country. My husband at that time, he sponsored me. He was a fiancé at that time, so I came. Then I became a resident, of course. I didn't have any problems finding work. I waited, I think, about 4 years, and then I applied for citizenship. Of course, I wanted to be a Canadian really bad, and I was working, but it took me 3 years to get the citizenship. Does it take that long now?
Today, it's a little bit better. I mean, we have an online system which is pretty efficient. The government makes us kind of do all the work and upload it, so it's very easy to process. So today, I think you would have a bit of a different experience. I think it'd be a much better experience.
It'll be
today.
quicker?
It would be quicker. You just have to do a little bit more work, but it'll be quicker.
Is it difficult to bring a spouse?
That's a tough question. In some cases, yes. Again, we're looking for motivation. What is the applicant's motivation? Are they getting married and being sponsored because they want to live with this person? They're truly in love with this person. They plan on being together. Or is this just a way of getting into the country and then goodbye? And so obviously when you come from a country, let's say Cuba, we see a lot of refusals from Cuba. Why? It's a poor country. Everybody in Cuba wants to get out. And so the way they do that is they meet someone, they get married, they sponsor. Those are tough cases. If you come from a more successful country, more Western country, the United States, UK, something like that, they won't be looking behind the scenes as much as they do with countries that are having a bit of a challenge.
Boy, if it's difficult to adjudicate and decide values, trying to decide the true nature of love, I mean...
No, it's hard, but there is something that runs all through our immigration system that has to be looked at, and it's called fraud. You know, someone can give you all their documents to become a citizen or to show that they went to this university, and they're all inauthentic. We have to have the tools to try. We'll never get 100% of it. Try to detect that, and marriage fraud is one of those. You don't want an industry emerging where 10,000 people are marrying 10,000 Canadians a year and paying for them to do that and then becoming citizens. That undermines the whole system.
Just to give you an idea, Libby, he's not kidding. I've seen situations where an entire wedding was staged, right? They said this wedding took place in July, whatever it is, and you've got maybe 100 people, 150 people in that room. The officer was sharp enough to say, why are they wearing clothes that are so heavy for the summer? And the officer caught it.
Sounds like a good party. Thank you, Shuba. Next, we have Marissa. Hello, Marissa.
Hello, Libby. As a good citizen, Canadian citizen, how can I help those that come to Canada and need help? When I came with my visa, but not my citizenship. But I found support, of course, in your community and so forth. But how can we as Canadians put this good intention forward and help other people?
Every part of Canada even has alliances of these groups. Like there's one for the Toronto region. You can go to their website and see all the settlement organizations and NGOs that do all kinds of things. Filling forms, helping with legal challenges, helping babysit, while someone's going out and trying to find a job. Yeah. Pick the one you like. Not everyone takes volunteers, but most of them do.
Yeah.
And that's the lifeblood of our system. The fact that Canadians are engaged in the settlement process, and that we have this wonderful system where Canadians sponsor refugees to come to this country. Not infinite numbers, but larger numbers than any other country, and the success of that model is much greater than the state government-sponsored refugees who don't have that support.
And to the credit of Canadians, when we were in crisis, a lot of these legal aid clinics have to turn away people because they have so many volunteers, just like Marissa. So I think that's a real testament to there is a sentiment that we want to help people. We want to help people who we feel need our help. And we want to give back because we benefited from this country, so we want to pass that along to the next person. But legal clinics, I agree, there's lots of communities. As soon as you see a crisis, you know there's a clinic out there looking for volunteers to help out.
Okay, thank you, Marissa. And when we come back, final thoughts from our panelists. That's next. Welcome back to the Zoomer. It's now time for final thoughts from our panelists, starting to my left.
I think what we need to do is have a more public discussion about immigration policy. It is who we are. We are creating a country for our children, our grandchildren, a legacy. We want a culture that is preserved, that is the values that are passed down from generation to generation. We are not having public debates. We see something come in through the email, a notice from immigration that something is coming out tomorrow. It's all done, it's all wrapped up in a bow. We didn't have an opportunity to discuss it and to see how it's going to play out. I think we need to do more of that and have that debate out here and exchange ideas because our country is valuable and what we represent is very valuable.
Immigration is good. Immigrants are good. We're a country of immigrants. But what is not good and what is not helpful is government policy on the fly. And that's presently what we've got with the Trudeau guys. It's what we got at the end of the Harper regime as well. and it's playing games with people's lives and their expectations. And that's not something we should be doing as a country, but unfortunately, as we get closer to an election year, that's what we've got.
Mass immigration, I think, is the term that should be used, and it affects lower middle class more than anyone. And if you look at the media landscape, you don't see any lower middle class representative in the media talking from their point of view, that what they're going through, what they're suffering from. It's always either cultural or basically intolerance. That's the usual conversation that's going on. Oh, we should be tolerant, we should be careful culturally. But there's a lot of things that comes with mass immigration, and it mostly affects lower middle class. And they should have a seat at the table.
The lower middle class feels pain and comes to dislike immigration to some extent when we don't have a good economic story to tell. Immigration in this country has been successful. It has contributed to everything in this country because we've grown as a country, because we've been a high-earning country, because we've been a relatively wealthy country. For 10 years, we have stagnated. Our per capita income in Canada for 10 years has not grown. It was equivalent to the United States 10 years ago. Now the US is 50% ahead of us. That's not a good background for immigration, and the best thing we can do to restore Canadians' faith in immigration is to get our economic policies right. That's going to take a new team in Ottawa and a new approach and a new debate among Canadians.
Well, most of us want immigration to remain a cornerstone of Canadian life, but we have to make sure Canada continues to be a place where people can escape the old hatreds rather than importing them. And that's it for us this evening. To get in touch, send us an email at comments@thezoomer.com. As always, thank you to my panel and to you at home. We'll see you soon. For now, it's time to zoom out.